Hello again everyone, and welcome back to Learn Linux TV. In today's video, we're going to take a look at 5 different tweaks that you can implement in your Linux server to better protect OpenSSH from outside threats. OpenSSH itself is a very awesome technology because it's pretty much the closest standard that we have in the Linux community when it comes to remote management. You could use SSH to connect to your Linux server from just about anywhere with internet access, and then you can issue commands to your server as if you were standing right in front of it. But unfortunately, if someone else takes control of OpenSSH and gets access to your server, well, that's not a good day. We don't want that to happen. So in this video, like I mentioned, I'm going to go over 5 different methods that you can utilize to better protect OpenSSH on your Linux server. Now, if you've already seen my other videos on this topic, my older videos on this topic, well, this is an updated video. There's not a whole lot new here, but I want to make sure that I keep my content updated and fresh, which is why I'm coming out with this version. If nothing else, I'll have a video to point you guys back to anytime I'm asked how to better protect OpenSSH. Then this is the video that I'm going to send people back to. But if you're not already familiar with how to protect OpenSSH, well, do I have the video for you? In fact, you're watching it right now. And I can't wait to show you my 5 methods for better protecting OpenSSH. But before we get into that, I want to take a moment to mention the sponsor for today's video, Linode. Linode is a Linux-focused cloud server provider, and using their platform, you can get your very own Linux server in a matter of minutes. But having your very own Linux server, that actually sounds kind of expensive. But when it comes to Linode, you can actually set up a Linux server for as low as $5 a month. And if you use the URL that you see on the screen right now, you can actually get $100 in credit towards your new Linode account, and that'll be great to get you started, and you could definitely fit a lot of Linux within that $100 credit. So definitely check out Linode to get started. Using Linode's platform, you can set up your very own blog, a Nextcloud server, maybe a Minecraft server. There's all kinds of different things that you could create on their platform. But if you're not feeling particularly creative, then what you could do is actually practice the concepts that I'm going to teach you in this video, because if you have a server that you could use to get hands-on practice with, then that's awesome. In fact, Linode has all kinds of distributions available, so you could check out the various tutorials on Learn Linux TV, while at the same time spinning up your very own Linux servers on Linode's platform that you can use to go along with the tutorials. And if I cover it on Learn Linux TV, then chances are they offer it on Linode because they have all the distributions that you might be interested in, such as Debian, Ubuntu, CentOS, and many others. Thanks again to Linode for sponsoring today's video, as well as many others on this channel. They've been a sponsor for quite some time now, and I really appreciate it. So let's go ahead and dive in and check out my 5 tweaks for better protecting OpenSSH on your Linux server. Now, the first tip that I want to give you when it comes to protecting SSH is not really a tip, but it's something that I probably should mention, so I'm going to call this tweak number 0. It's not a very good one, but it is effective. In fact, this particular tweak will make it actually impossible for someone to gain access to your server via SSH. And you might already know where I'm going with this. But anyway, tweak number 0 is to simply stop SSH and disable it. And we can do that by running sudo systemctl stop sshd. And then we can also disable it as well. And now, congratulations, nobody can get into your server via SSH. However, this is not something that most people would ever consider because we want to make sure that we could benefit from SSH, and by turning it off, well, we can't use it. So that's not really an effective tweak. However, this tweak might actually be great if you have no intention at all of ever using SSH. In that case, the main point in this section is that if you're not using it, make sure that you turn it off. And that goes for any other service that you might be running on your Linux server or workstation. If it has no use for you, then disable it. But when it comes to Linux servers though, we especially want to benefit from SSH, so turning it off is not really a solution at all. So what I'm going to do is re-enable it. And I'll also start it back up as well. And as you can see, SSH is running. So assuming that disabling SSH is not an option for you, and I'm sure that's true for most of you, what we need to do is find a way to keep it running, but also make it relatively secure. And that brings us to our very first tweak. By default, SSH listens on port 22. But did you know that you can actually change the port that SSH listens on? Well, it's true. So what I'm going to do is open up the SSH config file, specifically the SSH daemon config file. So I use sudo and then nano to open up that file. And this is the file that we're going to spend the majority of the video fine-tuning. So you might want to consider writing down where the default config file actually is. And it's under /etc/ssh and then sshd_config. And you could use whatever text editor you'd like. Nano is just easier to explain in a video. My preference is Vim, but to each their own. I'm going to press enter. So here we have the SSH config file open, and we can start making some changes. So first and foremost, you can feel free to page up and page down through this file and see some of the various options that are here. We have a lot of options that are commented out, and we can uncomment those options if we'd like to change those options. For example, here's the port number right here, port 22. This is commented out, and the reason why it's commented out is because that's the default. So if you don't declare a port at all, then port 22 is going to be the port that the SSH service will listen on. But before we actually make changes, I'm going to hold Control and press X to exit out. What I would like to do is make a backup of the config file, so that way if we make a mistake, we have something to revert back to. So I'll run sudo and then cp for copy. We're going to copy the config file. And I'll just give it the extension .bak. It doesn't really matter, I just want to make it different. So now what we can do is go back into the config file and we can make our changes. And again, tweak number 1 is changing the port that SSH listens on. Now, one thing that I want to caution you on is that this actually isn't going to give you that much extra security at all. I mean, it might give you like 1% extra security, maybe 5%. So it really doesn't help all that much. But the reason why I'm including it on this list is because even though it doesn't offer a lot of value, it does offer some value. It makes it just a little bit harder for someone to get into your SSH server. Now, to be fair, if somebody really wants in, all they'll need to do is execute one port scan, and they'll find out what port you're running SSH on probably within a minute. And that's why I mentioned that this doesn't actually offer a lot of additional security. But one benefit that this will especially give you is that you'll see fewer attempts in the log files to get into your server via SSH, because any of the automated processes out there that just do a simple SSH check on port 22, they're going to hit your server, see that it's not open on that port, and then move on to a different server. If it's a targeted attack, somebody will probably still try to get in, and they'll find the port. But again, having fewer entries in the log files to go through, that does have some value, and that also helps protect against the simpler scripts out there, so this is worth doing. So what I'm going to do is uncomment this right here, and I'm going to change it to port 2222. I'm not sure if I would recommend that specific port, to be honest, because I think that's somewhat common, but I'm just going to use it as an example, so I think it works at least for this video. And that's really all there is to it. We've just changed the port that the SSH service will listen on, so I'll save the file. And since we did make a change to the configuration, what we should do is restart SSH to take advantage of the new setting. So I'll run sudo systemctl restart and then sshd, just like that. So now that we've restarted SSH, let's go ahead and check the status, make sure that it's actually running. And as you can see, it is. In fact, right here it's telling us that the server is listening on port 2222. So if I didn't know any better, I would say that this change was effective. Now, before we go any further, I just want to mention real quick that I'm on a Fedora system, and currently I have SE Linux disabled. And I don't recommend that you disable SE Linux because, well, you're lowering your security by doing so. But some of the changes and tweaks, including this one right here, will actually be denied when you go to restart SSH because it's actually in violation of the SE Linux policy. Now, this is specific to any Linux distribution that uses SE Linux, and you'll know right away if it's your problem if you go to restart SSH, and then you see that the restart failed and the service didn't come back up. Now, going over SE Linux and how to make a custom policy is beyond the scope of this video. I just wanted to mention that in case any of you run into this. Anyway, as we can see, SSH is listening on port 2222, so our change was effective. Now, let's check out tweak number 2. With this particular tweak, it's actually more of a suggestion than a tweak. I highly recommend that you disable the root account, or at least never use it for SSH. In the SSH config file, you can actually disable root's ability to log in via SSH, and I highly recommend that you do that. Now, there's a few things that are required in order for this to work. First and foremost, you'll have to have a user account other than root that you could use to log in with, preferably one with sudo access. So I'll leave it up to you to create that. I do have a video on my channel already that goes over how to create a new user account, so rather than explain that all over again, I'll just point you to that video and I'll put a card for it right about here. Once you have that account created and it's ready to go, then the next step is to go back to the SSH config file and disable root's ability to log in. And back here on my test system, what we're going to do is open up the SSH config file yet again, and I'll show you where to make that change. All right, so back in the config file, let's look for the option permit root login. So I'm just going to keep scrolling down until I find it. Now, before I scroll any further, I want to mention right here, and I didn't notice this before, that the config file for SSH is literally giving you the command that you'll need to run if you do have SE Linux enabled. And you can just run this command right here to let SE Linux know about the fact that you've changed the port. So you could go ahead and try that on your own. If you actually do use SE Linux, then that could be a way to actually keep SE Linux enabled and still change the port. Anyway, let's continue. Now right here, we have the option that we're looking for, permit root login. The root account is the most powerful account on a Linux system. You probably already knew that, but it definitely bears repeating. If somebody's able to access your Linux server via root, then they have access to, well, everything. And we definitely don't want that. Now, by disabling root's ability to log in via SSH, we're not actually disabling root altogether. That's actually a completely different subject altogether. You can lock the root account, and maybe I might cover that in a different video, because in today's video, we're actually focusing on SSH in particular, and if nothing else, we should absolutely turn off root's ability to log in. Now, depending on your Linux distribution and how it's configured, the default for permit root login might be different. In this case, it's set to prohibit password, and it's actually commented out, so if we want to change this, the first thing we're going to have to do is remove the comment. Now, let's first talk about what prohibit password means. What that means is that root will not be able to log in via SSH by using a password. In this case, if that's attempted, then the person will be presented with a password prompt, but no matter what they type, even if they do in fact type the correct password, they will not get into the server. So the default here is actually pretty good, but in a lot of cases, permit root login will be set to yes, which means that everybody will try to log in as root, and we definitely want to prevent that. Now, what I like to do is actually change this to no. And you should only do this if you already have another user account on the system that you've already set up. Assuming that that's what you have, then what we'll do is erase all of this right here, and we're going to set this to no. We'll save the file, we'll exit out, and then again, we'll go ahead and restart SSH. We'll make sure that everything is good. And it looks good to me. Anyway, at this point, no matter what the person types, they will not be able to log into the server via root. And that's awesome, because having somebody else actually access our server via root, that would not be a good thing. So now let's move on to tweak number 3. And for tweak number 3, we will yet again open up the SSH config file, because like most of the tweaks in this video, we're going to actually implement this tweak right here. And inside the file, what we're looking for is the ability to disable password authentication altogether. So let's scroll down and see if we can find it. And here it is. So password authentication means pretty much what you might think it means. If this is enabled, which it is by default, then you'll be able to log into the server via SSH, be prompted for a password, and you'll be able to get into the server if you do type the right password. Now the problem with this is that if you're able to get a password prompt, then other people are able to get a password prompt as well. And if your server is reachable via the public internet, then what that means is that a lot of people will try to get into your server. They will try to brute force the password, and eventually they'll probably get in. But if you actually disable password authentication, then they'll never be able to enter a password because that method of authentication is simply not allowed. Again, by default, it is turned on. As you can see right here, it's set to yes. And like always, if we want to actually change this option, we'll first remove the hash symbol to uncomment this. And what we'll do is actually change this to no. But before we actually save this file and restart SSH, what we're going to need first is an SSH key, and we will need that SSH key associated with the server or workstation or whatever it is that we're trying to log into. We'll actually need to make sure that the public key is here on the server, otherwise we will not be able to log in as soon as we save this and restart SSH. Now, I have another video on my channel that goes over SSH and also the ability to set up a key for authentication. So I'm not going to show you that in this video. What I will do is leave a card right here, and you can watch that particular video to find out how to create an SSH key, associate that with your server, and once you do that, you'll then be able to set this to no, save the file, and restart SSH. Again, check out that video. And you know what? Of all the tweaks that I'm going over in this video, this one right here is going to absolutely give you the most additional security benefit compared to all the others. So even if you don't actually implement any of the other tweaks, this one right here is absolutely the most important. Now, on my end, I'm not going to save this file. What I'm going to do instead is hold Control and press X, and I'll say no, because I actually have not created a key on this server just yet. So in my case, it would not be a good idea for me to save this. But again, check out that other video, set up your SSH key, verify that it works, and then go in this file and disable password authentication, and your security will be all the better for it. All right, so let's move on to tweak number 4. Now for this one, I can't actually show you this because what I'm going to recommend is that you create a firewall rule to only allow SSH from a very specific IP address. But the problem with this is that every Linux distribution has a different firewall. Essentially, there's several different ones. There's IP tables, there's UFW, which can also help you configure IP tables, among others. But there's also hardware firewalls, and if you're using a cloud platform such as something like Linode, you can go on there and actually add a firewall at that level. And I usually recommend to create a firewall at your hypervisor level, the cloud, management dashboard level, in front of your machines rather than in your machines. There's nothing wrong with setting up a firewall inside your Linux servers, and many people do, but there's something to be said about having a dashboard or some kind of central configuration that you can use to actually create a firewall. Anyway, by protecting SSH with a firewall and only allowing access from a single IP address, this is also going to drastically improve your security, and it's going to, rival the previous tweak in terms of effectiveness. Adding a firewall is definitely a very important thing to do. But there's one issue here. Depending on the IP address of wherever your office is, if that IP address changes frequently or even regularly, then what you're going to do is find yourself actually updating that firewall and that firewall rule constantly anytime your IP changes. So this particular tweak is the most effective if you have a static IP address that does not change. If that's the case, then you can simply whitelist that IP address, and then from that point forward, you have to be coming from that IP in order to access the SSH service on the server, and that will lock out anyone who's not coming from that IP, which is why firewalls are awesome. Again, there's various firewalls out there, so I can't show you the process here because it changes depending on your infrastructure, but I will be creating firewall videos on this channel for the various different firewall solutions that are out there. So stay tuned to this channel, and I'll give you some instructions on how to do that at a later date. But for right now, just simply consider a firewall in front of SSH because that'll certainly help. Now, as for tweak number 5, my final suggestion for today's video, this suggestion involves using a hardware key for security. Now, there's several different keys out there made by various companies, but effectively what these are generally or most likely a USB device with a button on it, and you simply insert it into your computer, you'll be prompted to press the button, and by doing so, you'll then be allowed into the server. Now, using a hardware key actually doesn't replace the need or the suggestion for an SSH key. This is something that you can actually use on top of an SSH key, but having a hardware device, maybe something like the YubiKey, for example, that will absolutely improve your security because if somebody actually does get past your key, maybe they, I don't know, got a hold of your key somehow, they still can't get into the server unless they also have possession of your hardware key. Now, when it comes to implementing a security key, I have an entire video on the YubiKey that'll show you the process. So rather than repeat all of that here and make this video another 30 minutes long, well, I don't know if it'll actually make it that much longer, but the point is, I don't want to repeat myself because I've already covered this. So I'll put a video link right about here that you could go to check out the YubiKey guide that I've recently created and uploaded to this channel. So check that out, and you'll learn everything you might ever want to know about implementing the YubiKey. And if you do that, you'll definitely add another layer of security to SSH, and the more layers you have, the better. Anyway, those are my 5 tweaks for improving the security of SSH on your server or workstation, and I hope it helped you out. If it has, please click that like button and also subscribe because I have some awesome videos coming very soon, if I do say so myself. And I definitely don't want you to miss that content because on this channel, it's all about learning Linux, and I have so much to teach you that I have barely even gotten started. Anyway, thanks so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you again very soon.